what I'd like you to do is to defend really your psychological portrait, which, to put it simply, says that a young boy living up country Queensland loses his father tragically, is treated maybe badly, maybe not, by those who own the farm, and is so disoriented by this experience that in a way it fuels him, gives him a kind of rage which he goes into politics to somehow do something about. I mean, that may be unfair, but that's my reading.
It's a boiled down reading, golly, I'm going to be a bit circuitous in my answer. When I, years ago, was writing about Patrick White, the Freudian biography was all the rage, and biography was said to be, at that time, by many people, valueless unless it was a Freudian study of the development of the subject, with Freudian language, and I argued passionately against that. I thought it was completely bogus, and bogus for some of the reasons that my antagonist on Q&A said the other night. This man is not on your couch. You cannot diagnose him with any kind of scientific clarity, and I agree with her. However, one of the survival mechanisms of the human race is that we try to work out how other people operate, how they think and behave. It's one of the ways societies work. We all do it, we do it all the time. Journalists do it a great deal of the time, and biographers rather make a specialty of it. But I believe it needs to be done discreetly and carefully. And with my examination of Rudd, I clutch rather strongly onto the fact that his life fulfills an interesting pattern. I'm not pretending that I've discovered a one-off here. In fact, nearly everything about Rudd's character, what's good and what's bad, is present in most politicians in different measures. He's interesting to me because of the weightings various aspects of his character have, but I don't use psychiatric language, and I am careful about my conclusions. And one of the people I trust most about Rudd's character is Rudd. And Rudd talks about the origins of his politics being the experience of his childhood. And Rudd talks about the impact of his father's death, the expulsion from the farm, and then the 2 terrible years he spent in a Catholic boarding school. He talks about the way in which that has shaped the passions of his politics and his career. I rely very much on the subject himself. As for the anger, there's a great deal of evidence for it. The fact that he lost his block with me is not completely remarkable. What's a bit unusual is that I wrote about it. Politicians lose their blocks with journalists all the time. In fact, the other night, Tony Jones told me about an occasion, I can't remember whether it was late in the time that Rudd was leader of the opposition or early in the time he was in government, where Rudd simply wouldn't let him out of a studio and just went him for 20 minutes in what sounds like the same kind of performance he did for me. I'm lucky I don't live and work in Canberra. I don't have to ever darken Rudd's doorstep again. I went, I wrote about him, and I came back, and that's it as far as I'm concerned. That's it. Other journalists have to deal with and live with politicians. So outbursts of rage don't much get written about. Keating's did in the end because they were so astonishingly flamboyant. The telephone calls from Keating were experiences that some people came to actually welcome because they were performances. That was the sort of Cirque du Soleil of politicians' anger. But I've written about it. I'm as convinced as I sit here as I was sitting in front of Rudd on that terrace in Mackay, that it is when he is angry that you see the real man. Now, there's a great deal more to the man than anger, and I don't believe that anger disqualifies anybody from public life. But that is, I think, when you see the real man with the mask slipping.
I mean, I don't want to conduct an argument about it.
Go ahead.
No, because
it's a windy, cold night, and people have come for entertainment.
Time is limited, and there are lots of other things. I mean, I just say this, that what I don't doubt that he said to you, and indeed I believe it to almost certainly true, that the experience he had as a young fellow made him interested in social welfare and the idea that the welfare state is a good thing. It actually was what happened to me. My father died at roughly the same age, and I know that the fact that there were people helping us as a family, strangers coming to Jewish refugees, giving us help, had an enormous effect on making me think about the welfare state differently from neoliberals. I don't doubt any of that. What I suppose I'm a bit sceptical about is the connection between that, which is Rudds' account of much of his political passion, and this sort of psychological rage which you encounter in him. I mean, all I think is when I think about people that I know, indeed when I think about myself, what drives us all, I think, is quite mysterious and rather difficult to fathom. And that's why I'm slightly sympathetic to the idea that you have to get to know someone exceedingly well before the sort of, before the real pattern of their drives becomes clear. And what really is going on, usually I think in the very early years of their life, becomes clear to us. So that's my scepticism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other thing for me is that Rudd is part of a pattern of political leaders who when young, lose their fathers. I'm fascinated by that pattern. I talk about the pattern in the essay. Yes. And I rely to some extent on the work that has been done by people who have examined that pattern and the impact it has on those people. And as well as, I mean, to lose your father in the way that Rudd lost his father, and then to have an astonishingly strong drive to power, appear to be connected by experience of many other people. The religiosity of the man is another aspect of that. And another aspect of it is dealing very poorly with other human beings, and particularly the ones that you work with. Now, I don't know whether any of those qualities have emerged in you, Robert, as a result of your own experience, but you've not driven yourself to high office. But the pattern as well is there. But you know,
I haven't had a fight in 30-something years at my university, as a matter of fact.
Well, Rudd is astonishingly disliked by those who have worked closely with him for any length of time.
Can I take up the religiosity part of it? Again, when I read his essay, Faith and Politics, which was published in the Monthly, I, to my shame now in a way, became a Ruddite, in that we were living in the days of the desert of John Howard, when no one spoke like that on either side of politics. And here was a man speaking from the Sermon on the Mount as to how one should have policy for asylum seekers and climate change.
But it was a good essay too. It was intelligent. It was beautifully argued.
I've come to doubt it, but I mainly wanted to get your take on it. My doubt is partly that, and it comes from Max Weber, who wrote a wonderful essay called Politics as a Vocation, and I reread it recently to check this, and he said that anyone who thinks that day-to-day politics can be built upon the Sermon on the Mount, uses the Sermon on the Mount, is an infant. And I mean, it's a very hard realist position, but nevertheless, there's something in the essay when I went back to it recently that made me worried, and it is to do with that there's a sort of, in my view, there's a kind of disconnect between the high-blown rhetoric, Christian moral rhetoric of Rudd, and his openness to the kind of New South Wales right, to the hard-nosed, pragmatic politics, as if he hasn't connected his values properly with political practice. I just wondered what...
I absolutely agree. I'm not one of those people who believes Rudd has no values and believes nothing, and look at how he's turned out. A man who turns out like that couldn't have meant any of the things that he said. I think indeed he did mean the things he said, but as I argue in the essay, he has failed spectacularly to deliver according to the Christian values that he himself talked about. He talked about the values that would inform his politics, and he talked, for instance, while leader of the opposition, he said he would have no part of any government that resiled in any way from our full obligations under the Vienna Conventions towards refugees. No part. The failure is spectacular. Perhaps we'll get to that in a minute. But just on the role of religion, here is me arguing for my discretion, because I can't prove this, but this is what is in my mind about people who flaunt their religion in public life. Religion makes people feel really wonderful about themselves. That's the role of religion very often in public life. You feel great about yourself. You feel that you have a connection to the infinite. Now that's there, got that in the essay. But you feel as though that what you are doing has gets the greatest approval of all, the approval of our Lord. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very sceptical about religion in public life, because it's essentially a feel-good thing. And in Rudd's case, it certainly has, and I don't know whether it makes Rudd feel good. It certainly makes him feel that he has connection to the infinite, but it has not served him at all as a source of values that he's willing to defend in the political hurly-burly of government. And here is this fascinating contradiction about Rudd. Rudd sold himself to the public as the kind of man who wrote that essay in the Monthly, and I believe he is those things. But he sold himself to the party as a relentless and skillful fighter in big brawls. He sold himself to the party because of the magnificent job he did attacking the government over AWB. That's why the New South Wales people decided to break with Beazley and back him in a caucus push as leader of the opposition, because they didn't think Beazley was doing a good enough job fighting work choices. They thought this other guy, the Queensland man, was a man who could do a better job of making sure that Howard was destroyed over work choices. And that's what happened. So the party put him in because of a set of qualities, and the public voted him in for a completely different set of qualities. And when the government began, those two sets of qualities came into direct collision. And his backers, let me tell you, in New South Wales, in Sussex Street, in New South Wales, they don't give a flying whatever for global warming. They think it is a ridiculous moral distraction to the real business of government, which is staying in power. And Rudd has, in the end, gone with his backers against his own better nature and has essentially busted his own brand.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of things about that. I was going to intervene, but I didn't get into it.
Didn't give you a chance.
Didn't give me a chance. I mean, I actually think your account of Christianity and politics is a bit one-sided. I mean, many Christians and many religious people, but particularly Christians, feel that they are sinners, feel that God is watching them, but watching them harshly all the time. And Calvinists, you know, who are the worst of this, wait for all the signs that they are saved, but they believe in basically that they're damned.
In their heart of hearts, they're going to burn.
That's right. And so I think religion is a bit more complex, or Christianity is a bit more complex psychologically than you say. It can be, as you say, that one is good and God is looking favourably upon one. Maybe a lot of Americans, to be unfair, do think like that, but I think a deeply religious person doesn't. Now, but I mean, I suppose we agree on the fundamental point that Bonhoeffer into Abib don't go.
No.
You can't be both. You choose one or the other. And I think the problem with Rudd, in a way, is that he hasn't been able to choose one or the other. He somehow hoped that he could retain the moral integrity of someone who took their bearings from the great anti-Nazi hero. On the other hand, while listening on a daily basis to Sussex Street, in your case. And I thought, I mean, we're now jumping and I'll go back to other things, but I thought when he gave in on the ETS and said we won't do it for 3 or 4 years, or 3 years, whatever, I think he looked shattered. Not because the polls were down, but because the Bonhoeffer and Arbib part of him had collided finally. He'd taken the decision on clever advice, get it off the agenda, but he knows, I think he knows in his heart that if he stands for anything, it's for the fight of climate change. You begin with vivid passages of what he was like in Copenhagen, where he worked 25 hours a day to try and bring it about. So I wondered if you think there's something in that it's been a shattering experience for him, for the two parts of his kind of political and personal being to come apart.
It is said that he has been shattered by the public response, because it appears, and I don't have first-hand knowledge of this, but it appears that the kind of hard-nosed advice in Canberra, led by the New South Wales people, was that because of the efflorescence last year, particularly, of the climate deniers. I mean, the climate deniers were just getting this spectacular run everywhere. And because the polling was showing that that the people were going a bit soft on climate change, and because, of course, the dreadful problems of this Senate for this government, which must never be overlooked in any of the critique of Rudd, the uniquely difficult Senate he has to deal with, and a uniquely obstructive leader of the opposition, that dumping ETS in this way was sensible and wouldn't be much missed by the public. And I think if Rudd is shattered, as I understand it, he's shattered because he held out for a very long time against dumping it, was finally swayed by Arbib and Wayne Swan to dump it, and was astonished by the public's response.
That's interesting.
The response of the public has caught them unawares.
Yes. Now, can I take you back to something I did want to raise with you? And it's something that's not in the essay much, and it's something that I wondered what you thought about. And that is, my personal view is that the political culture shifted under John Howard, and I think we fought many similar battles during those years.
I was only ever a reporter, Robert.
I was only ever a scholar. And I think a poison was kind of introduced to the country in many ways on many issues, or maybe that's too strong, but something unpleasant. What isn't in your essay, and this is, I think, partly will help explain Rudd to future generations, is how one copes after that period, if one is a sort of Bonhoeffer man, as I think he is. In other words, you don't seem to me to account for the difficulty of someone coming in after a period of such cynicism, such a kind of retreat from the more hopeful values of the period from Whitlam through Fraser to Hawke and Keating. So I just wondered if there's an element there of Rudd, as it were, having to cope with that kind of conservative populism on all sorts of issues.
I don't see it that way, you see. I think the astonishing popularity that Rudd enjoyed from the moment he became leader of the opposition was a mark of the community's wish to put the worst of the Howard years behind us, and that they didn't represent a challenge or a difficulty. In fact, it represented an opportunity, and that much of the way in which Rudd sold himself in that year before he became Prime Minister was, I mean, he took some of the qualities of Howard, and particularly on sort of economic affairs and on social policy. The two are virtually indistinguishable in questions of marriage and things like that. But by promising to bring back truthfulness above all, and the Bonhoeffer essay, in my view, is essentially about truthfulness and about the willingness of a man to martyr himself for the truth, in Bonhoeffer's case. In fact, I'm really, really intrigued by Rudd's passion for martyrs. Bonhoeffer, Sir Thomas More, he studied A Man for All Seasons in his final year at school, and I think we are all marked by the texts we study in our final year at school. And I heard the other day that he was recently talking to somebody about how much he loved Caravaggio's depictions of the martyrdom of John the Baptist. Again, sort of martyrdom. I wonder sometimes whether his passion for Whitlam is a bit about martyrdom as well. Anyway, I said, yeah, anyway, martyrs.
So I'm making the case that
I don't think...
political culture has shifted, and it's quite difficult.
I think the political culture was keen to shift back again.
Can I take up the issue that where we absolutely share values, but my political judgments are a bit different, which is asylum seekers. I'm of the view that given how Howard treated the issue and how well he did out of it, which your book with Marion Wilkinson is the best account and will be the definitive account, I'm of the view that it is very hard, it would be very hard for any Prime Minister now to deal with the asylum seeker issue. I've never been of the view that a Prime Minister can say to the Australian people, be generous, and they will. Certainly not after Howard. I think it's a really tough political question. And I think it is no accident, two things. I think it's no accident that when they became more humane in their policies, boats returned, and they hadn't during the Pacific Solution. That's my view. And secondly, I think the politics of it now are very tough. I think it's absurd, like you do, and I think it's inhumane, like you do. But I also think politically it is very difficult in the post-Howard era for a government to cope with this issue, where 70% of people, or whatever,
66% of people would welcome the return of the Pacific Solution.
Yeah. Now, and I don't think that's an accident.
That defines failure. Yes.
But perhaps we could talk a little bit. I don't want to talk a lot about that, but because I think Rudd is in a difficult position with that issue, and I think he's failed because he didn't predict what his policies would bring about. But I wouldn't like to be advising him. I'm not sure how you would do it.
Well, this was one of the causes of the Rudd's fury with me in Mackay.
This is 7:30 land stuff.
This is, well, sort of. I mean, he has spoken in the past so eloquently about the need to be humane to both people. He's absolutely aware of how trivial in numbers the problem is and how immense in political passions the problem is. He is also aware, and it speaks in a moving way, in a way that very few politicians do. He reminds Australians that the Geneva Conventions are about the Holocaust. They are the world's apology for the closing of doors at the Holocaust. Now, that's not something that Howard would ever talk about, and Rudd talks about it. He was talking about it only a week or so ago. He put into place a new policy which was said to be more humane, but it was based on the absurd notion that all of the processing should take place on a rock out in the Indian Ocean that had very limited capacity to deal with people. And I think he also approached I think the whole party approached the question of boat people in 2006, 2007, on the understanding that somehow the boats had gone away forever. And that they weren't going to come back. I mean, at the moment we're looking at a record arrival of people, of irregular arrivals by boat. Now, what I said to Rudd was, why don't you use your authority as Prime Minister, not to stand up and say, be kind or be generous, but to stand up and say, calm down, and to talk about the true scale of the problem, to try to teach people in Australia how small the problem is. You know, that we're talking about 25,000 people over 34 years. You know, those basic things. And he, on the record in the essay, he essentially says that he believed himself unable to influence public opinion on this issue. There's the Prime Minister telling me for publication that he is powerless to change the public's view on this issue. Now, later on... You call him a spectator at the record. Spectator at the wreckage, yeah. And later on, and unfortunately it's off the record and therefore I can't tell you what he said, but he certainly returned to the issue when he was ticking me off, and he returned to the issue very passionately. Now, I agree with you that it is a very difficult political issue, but my view is that it remains a very difficult political issue because both sides of politics use it when they wish. They know that under this country there is what I call a great artesian basin of racial disquiet, and if it suits them, they'll put a drill right down into it. And Labor did it under Howard. One Nation weren't the only people in 1999, 2000, early 2001 saying the Howard government had failed to discipline the arrival of boat people. Labor was doing it. They're up to their necks in it. And then, of course, that Tony Abbott is doing it now. I've tried to engage both leaders on the theology of this, because both Rudd and Abbott talk about this in religious terms, talk about our obligations to boat people in religious terms, even though both, I think, in my view, are spectacularly error. But anyway, they talk about the Good Samaritan. And I've tried with Abbott and I've tried with Rudd up in Mackay to point out the second chapter of Matthew, what happened to Christ after his birth. The family fled to Egypt. For Christians, his mission on earth was only accomplished thanks to the generous refugee policies of the Egyptian government. I can't get up a discussion with either man on the second chapter of Matthew. I just can't.
I'll ask another question because I've got to... you wrote a book about the Bill Henson affair.
Yes.
And when Mr. Rudd commented on it, I can't remember his exact words, but
absolutely revolting.
Absolutely revolting. So I wonder, David, whether what you make of what you call the prudery of Mr. Rudd and his government, and how much you dislike it.
It's funny, you know, I just sort of think of it as another strange factor in the life of this country, that this prudery exists. It's not uncontested in the government. I think there's more to Rudd's response to the Henson photographs than prudery.
You say it's linked to his childhood. I didn't quite know what you meant.
Well, Rudd has an absolutely passionate and winning, for the most part, response to children, and particularly to children in peril. The apology speech, which will survive, I think, as one of the great pieces of oratory in the history of this country, that is about imperiled children. Yes, they're black children, but they're imperiled children. And I think that that is the source of his absolute human commitment to that cause. His response to the Henson photographs, I think, is coarse and misjudged, but I think it comes from the same source.
Feeling the child is vulnerable.
Feeling that the child is vulnerable. And from his point of view, being utterly baffled that a child would place herself in that position, that an artist would want a child placed in that position. Now, I think that that's a very narrow view, as you know, and we differ on this. But the prudery of this country is just one of the continuing and often immensely comic aspects of life in Australia. The other day, the Classification Board allowed the release of Pasolini's film Salo on DVD. Now, the battle over Salo goes all the way back to the making of that film, which is something over 40 years ago. It was allowed in Australia. It was banned in Australia. But just recently, the Classification Board has said, you know, we'll allow it to be shown in DVD. There are almost no countries on earth left that ban Salo. But Salo is like the battle of the Somme of censorship in Australia. And so it's been allowed by the Classification Board. There was an appeal to the Review Board. The Review Board allowed it. And there is in Canberra a cabal of senior politicians who are in meltdown over Salo. And that's the prudery of this country. I think I would admire prudery more if it wasn't usually a cover for lies. I would admire
but
it
it doesn't make you hostile to Mr. Rudd.
No, it doesn't make me hostile to Mr. Rudd at all. I'm interested in his prudery. When he was at university, he was actually a campaigning prude. And one of the things that that we talked about on the beach at Mackay was Calvin's Geneva. He's a very interesting man. He's enormously widely read. And we talked about the nature of politics in utopias.
Yes.
He's not, he's a man of very straightforward, conservative, social instincts. And that's fine by me. I'll criticise him when I think they're absurd, but that's fine by me. And I think that's all genuine. That's not a manufactured part of himself. A lot of himself is manufactured, put together from bits and pieces. That's not.
Because time is flying, some questions I want to ask towards the heart of your essay, and I think its most important contribution. And that is really the breakdown of process in government, which I'd read bits and pieces in the newspapers about, but I think you've captured it more vividly and more plausibly and persuasively than anyone I've read. You say two things. One is the breakdown of process. The other is the incredible unpopularity of him in Canberra. I would like you to speak about both things.
Well, the breakdown of process. We might, it might be something we develop more. But that marvellous journalist who now writes for the Australian Financial Review, Laura Tingle, was the one who was able to report this government has barely leaked in its first term. The security of information has been astonishing. The loyalty of people to the government itself has been astonishing. But Laura Tingle got this amazing leak about the nature of cabinet government in Australia now, which is that cabinet ministers arrive in the cabinet room to find a folder in front of them, a folder of documents they are not allowed to take away. A folder of documents which records the decisions that have already been made by what's known as the Gang of Four, which is Rudd, Gillard, Swan and Tanner. They cop it. Well, they've copped it up to a point and then they leaked it. But several other things have broken down as well. And the main thing to my mind that has broken down is the tradition or the practice of circulating proposals to all ministers a fortnight before they come up for cabinet, so that everybody can look at them and think about them, and so that ministers can talk to their own departments about them, in order to, is this sensible? Is this a good idea? It's scrutiny across the cabinet. That's disappeared. Rudd's own office is the office in which all major decisions have to be taken, in which all of in the minds of the government, crucial decisions about when announcements are made. And the protocol of announcements is incredibly important for this government. The restriction of information to a very, very small number of cabinet ministers is partly about wanting to be the absolute controllers of information, partly about Rudd's own wish to be at the centre of things. Well, I mean, he's the Prime Minister, for God's sake. He's got to be at the centre of things. But he is, to an extent, that has broken down the structure of cabinet government as we understand it. And it seems to me that one of the challenges for his ministers is to simply insist on governing, that Australia must be governed in the way it is traditionally governed by cabinet. And that is not happening at the moment. Your second question?
No. I've got two more questions, then I really do want to open up the floor, but two things I must ask you. The first is this, that when he said he would abandon the ETS, the normal interpretation, one you make and one I would have made, had I written about it at the time, is that this comes from risk averseness, that he is a coward. When he announced 3 or 4 days later the new mining tax, the most obvious interpretation is to say that he's crazy brave.
Yep.
How could he take on the most powerful lobby in the country without any political preparation of public opinion and so on? How do we account for this apparent contradiction? Risk averseness on Friday, crazy brave on Tuesday.
the spine of the essay is, in a sense, his handling of global warming. It begins in Copenhagen and sort of politically ends with the abandonment of the ETS. And at every stage in that process, I was fascinated by the contradiction between high moral purpose and cowardice. By the time the negotiations with Malcolm Turnbull had finished, it seemed to me that he had given away everything worth fighting for. And, you know, brown coal, burn it forever, and here's billions of dollars to help you burn it. I mean, it was just ludicrous. And so a good deal of the essay is about the question of courage. The crazy brave brawl with the miners is, of course, about judgment and technique. It seems to me that the interesting character of this man plays itself out most in problems of technique because of his overwhelming sense of being the brightest person in any room on earth, because of his problems of trust, because of the way he works with people. Government has evolved in the way it's evolved, with a good deal of difficulties. But there's also a question of Rudd, the question of judgment. And a part of the essay is about his time as the chief bureaucrat for Wayne Goss in Queensland, because I must say it was one of the things that got him a bit upset at Mackay. I'm interested in whether his government in Canberra is going to go the same way as Wayne Goss's in Queensland. And talking to people who worked with him in Queensland, you always have this sense of how this question kept coming up with these people of Rudd's political judgment, that he was doing in Queensland things that needed to be done, cried out to be done, after 30 years of misgovernment under the Nationals in Queensland. But the Goss government in general, and Rudd in particular, kept stumbling politically as these things were done. I'm not talking about the road that was going to kill koalas. Rudd actually had nothing to do with that. But what he did for Goss made Rudd enormously unpopular in Queensland, even though on paper, when you look at what he did, you think that's absolutely admirable that he did those things. They had to be done. But the way in which he did it, the particular way in which he did it, was politically ham-fisted. And that seems to be what we're now looking at with the miners' brawl, though questions of technique are not now at the centre, I think, of what we should be paying attention to in the miners' brawl, because the miners' brawl is actually a brawl between mining and government in Australia now. And BHP and Rio want to break this government. They don't want to break the tax proposal. They want to get rid of the government. They want to get rid of Rudd. This is a really interesting brawl in the history of this country. We're back where we were with Chifley and the banks in the late 1940s, and it's not about the shape of the tax, it's about the shape of our politics.
And my final question, and then I'll open to the audience for 15 minutes. My final question is this. I think, and you've told me there is evidence for this, that Rudd was shattered by the response to his withdrawal ETS. And I feel that he is a sort of shattered man at the moment. My question is there any coming back for him? I'm not asking the gallery question is, will he win the next election or will his government win them? But can he regain the opinion of both the political class and the country? Or has he had it?
No, he hasn't had it. He hasn't had it. Rudd is a person who has been underestimated at every single stage of his career.
They used to say that, Hitler.
Yeah, he's underestimated. He has learnt to be what he has wanted to be at each stage of his career. Not a lot comes naturally to Rudd, but he is a hard taskmaster of himself. He taught himself to be a bureaucrat. He taught himself to be a Labor candidate. He taught himself to be a member of caucus. He taught himself to be a leader of the opposition. Now, there's no other way on earth to learn to be a Prime Minister but by being a Prime Minister, and I think he's capable of teaching himself to be a Prime Minister. What the public requires from him are some wins. The health stuff was a mess. Everybody, I think, can now sort of understand it's a mess, and the refusal of Western Australia to come in on that mess devalued it greatly for Rudd. But at least it wasn't a complete disaster for him. If he wins this fight with the mines, we will look back on these months and wondered why we so doubted him. Because what he requires politically, and probably personally, is a big win. And it's not for nothing that this man's an admirer of Gough Whitlam, because I think what we're watching at the moment is crash through or crash.
Yeah, but we know what happens.
And if he crashes through, his standing politically and personally will be immensely restored. But he won't any longer be what we thought he was before he became Prime Minister. We'll have a better understanding of what he is, of his strengths and weaknesses. But I think it would be very, very foolish of people to write this man off.
In regard to running the mining issue, I can't remember who the economist was who was referring to it, but he put forward the proposition that the reason the mining companies are running so heavily on this issue is because they see Australia as a trendsetter, and that if it gets away in Australia, there's a possibility of it having a domino effect in other less advantaged countries. Just wondering what you think of that prospect.
As these rows go on over time, weeks after weeks after weeks, there's a bit of a temptation to try to find fresh reasons for what's going on. That's a gorgeous reason. It's a really gorgeous reason. But there is a much simpler reason. They don't want to give the money to the government.
I mean, if I'm allowed to say, I actually think there's more to the question than David does, in that these are multinational companies, and if Australia can impose this tax, then many other countries where they also mine will impose the tax. So they don't want to pay the money to the Australian government, but they definitely don't want to pay it to half a dozen other
They don't
governments.
want to pay it to anybody.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's why it could set a really dangerous precedent, I think.
I attended a conference in Monash some 8 or 9 years ago when Lord Desai, who at that stage I think was in his early 80s, addressed a group about governance generally and politics in the broader sense, and made the comment that following Churchill's comment that democracy was the best of a bad bunch of systems, that his view on it was somewhat similar, that it is the best of a bad bunch of systems, but he highlighted the point that it was because it gets rid of those quicker than any other alternative system. I just wonder, in terms of your assessment and evaluation of Rudd, is the democratic process that you just alluded to, that he may well become the strongest leader that we've ever had in that sense, might lead him to also perhaps be one of the most scary leaders that we'd ever had.
I wouldn't argue that in organisational terms, he's certainly the strongest Labor leader for about half a century. Probably you have to go back to the wartime Labor leaders to find a Labor Prime Minister that exerts such absolute organisational control over the party. And there might even be an argument that he exerts more than those wartime leaders. That's organisational power. One of the many fascinating things about this man is the question of whether he is actually able to employ the power that he has done so much to acquire. Is he actually good with power? Can he make power work for him? And there are some questions about that, and there are people who I quote in the essay who say, no, he's not very good at it. He likes to hoard it, he doesn't like to spend it. And with Rudd, there is, I think, a confusion between control and power. They're not the same thing, but I think he thinks that they are the same thing. The great thing about democracies is that we can look at our leaders and work out what they're really like. And the scrutiny of the Australian community of leaders is ruthless, really ruthless. Now, it doesn't mean that you necessarily get rid of somebody you dislike, but we get to know them pretty well, and we deal with them on that basis. The scrutiny of the Australian people of Tony Abbott is ruthless, and they don't like him.
Can you comment on the government's decision to advertise in relation to its RSPT policy? So I think this decision has the potential to be a blight on our democracy for such a long period of time, where governments can just go ahead and spend public money on what is effectively political advertising when it hasn't been legislated. Do you share similar views?
I've probably got more vicious views on this than you, Robert. I mean, I just think that it is really shabby of the government to be doing this, particularly when they promised that they would not. I think it's very regrettable. Two other little things, though. I think they should get a better advertising agency if they're going to do it. And I can understand the temptation when you see the ruthless campaign of the miners. Maybe there's an argument to say that you've got to fight out these policy issues in public through advertising. But these people, the Labor Party pledged hand on heart that that is not what they would do, and they're doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me to highlight one thing about Rudd, which is that he often speaks, particularly when he's an opposition leader, speaks from the moral high ground without doing what trained politicians are meant to do, which is thinking, what will this mean in 5 years when I'm in power? And for him to say that meant that he couldn't do it. And then when he did it, I think it looks disgraceful. And you're not tougher than me on this. I think there should be a taxpayers' revolt. I think everyone who pays GST should withhold that proportion from them and go to prison. But anyhow, I suggested this during work choices, and I suggest it again without any...
He's got a taste for martyrdom too.
Little amounts.
Because of the ruthlessness of Australian politics of which you spoke, do you think it's inevitable that we're always going to be disappointed in our leaders?
Oh, of course. I mean, disappointment comes with the game. Every changes of government occur because a new leader comes along who can harvest the hopes of the nation. And grown-ups know that a good many of those hopes will inevitably be disappointed. And skilled politicians, part of the great skill of politics is to let your supporters down lightly when you do disappoint them. Now, I don't advance any of that to excuse, failures and breaking promises and lies and any of that kind of thing, but hopes in politics are always disappointed. And of course, events move on, things change, high hopes, with the best will in the world, high hopes can just be completely dashed. Would we have a disagreement there?
No.
No.
The melancholy conclusion is mine too.
Yes,
although I do think that there were all sorts of hopes alive with Keating. And it's not, I actually think now we have a particularly bad time in our politics where both leaders have disappointed in different ways, or both leaders are, in some ways, one has disappointed and the other is beyond the pale. For example, I think that during the Fraser years, Fraser was hated, but the Vietnamese boats started arriving. and neither side took advantage of it. Your idea of this oasis of racism under the surface, it was an incredibly good time in which Labor didn't exploit, and Fraser behaved with exemplary humanity in regard to that. So there are times in which I think our politicians have raised hopes rather than destroyed them. But in general, I think it is true that our hopes are dashed on the reality of life.
And the disappointments associated with this man are profound, because he did suggest.
That's what I think is so interesting about your essay, and what's so interesting about Kevin Rudd, that he did kind of raise hopes. And your essay, I think, is the first really important attempt to work out why they were disappointed. And it's, as I said at the beginning, prophetic in that you wrote before the full disappointments came through. Most of it was written before the ETS retreat.
This essay seems to have courted a lot of praise and controversy and attention, mainly because people know so little about Kevin Rudd the person. You spoke earlier about the fact that, Canberra politicians and Canberra journalists have the type of relationship where there are certain things that are reported and certain things that aren't. Do you think that the media is partly to blame for this gap in our knowledge of our leaders and our, the personalities of these people who are holding the reins?
You can always blame the media, but people take time to know, and this man is a hard man to know, and there are millions of words written about this man since he first decided to tell his story, which was in the beginning of 2003 to Michael Gordon at The Age, and that's the first time Rudd starts to talk about who he really is and what his life story is. And I think it was very painful for him to talk about that. And so it's a process that's only 7 or 8 years old, and it's going to go on and on. And as as the elections come up, there's going to be more character studies of Rudd and more attempts to bottle him and get it right. I've made one of these attempts, and I think it has brought some aspects of his character and life back to people, but I don't think the press can be blamed. I mean, I can't praise myself, and I can't blame everybody else. But it does, as I say, it does leave me free. I am free to come and go in Canberra, and I don't have to deal with this man ever again if I don't have to.
It occurs to me actually that the feeling, and you put it in the essay, and many people have said this, that we don't know Kevin Rudd. It occurs to me that maybe the reason we don't know him, or feel we don't know him, is that he doesn't altogether know himself, that there's something less solid or more problematic about him than Hawke, or about Keating, or about John Howard, and I could go on, Malcolm Fraser, that there's something, as it were, mysterious in the end near his centre to do with uncertainty about himself or what he is.
There's a statement I make right near the end of the essay, which I think might be wrong. I think it might be wrong. I was talking to him about himself, and I say once or twice he shies away from questions, declaring he's just not a reflective person. I don't believe him. I sense no one is more curious about the mysteries of Rudd than Rudd himself. I think I might not be right there. I think he is aware that there are mysteries there, but I suspect curiosity is not the right word. I think he fends them off. He has often said in interviews, and good interviews with good people, he's often said when cornered, oh look, I'm just not a reflective person. And I've read that as an excuse. I think it is in part an excuse, but I think in part it's probably true as well, that he doesn't want
to go somewhere.
He doesn't want to actually go to some of those places.
Yeah, that's mainstream.
And the big question really, is whether there is anything there to go to.
We're all humans, and there is always, I think,
Oh,
something
there is always something to go to, but how coherent it is when you get there is perhaps the question.
That's such a good point to end, that I will. I'm sorry if there were questions to come. It is my sworn duty to point out that there are many copies of David's splendid essay at the end of this extremely long room, and that David will go through the long march to get there and will sign them. So can I ask you to thank him for a splendid performance?
Thank you.